Hello everyone, I'm John Bauman from First United Church of Christ, and I wanted to do a video for the families and children at our church and for family and friends. This book is The King's Messenger, and it's by a personal friend of mine. Her name is Carolyn Clare Givens, and it's illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. So I had to read the book because I know her as Carrie. This book you can find on Amazon, and I can send you the link when I put this up, but I wanted to do a bedtime story. The book is called The King's Messenger. Chapter 1 is The King's Courtroom. Smuggins stood, as he had every day for years, ready, waiting in the king's courtroom. The king's castle was the center of all the kingdom, perched high in its city, rising from the plains around it. Most of the king's people loved him, but there were rumors of unrest at the edges of the kingdom, north, east, west, and south. Some did not trust the king's goodness. Smuggins was a messenger for the king. He had one of the most prestigious positions in the land, but he'd never yet been called upon to go. The king's messengers were more than just pages who carried papers from one place to another. He found his messengers from among the people of his kingdom. Smuggins was never quite sure what the king had seen in him to ask him to become a messenger, but somehow he'd come to the king's attention, and here he stood. The messengers were the king's most trusted servants, and he made sure they were given training for whatever task he placed before them. Sometimes the task was tricky. The king would be conducting business with a trade partner, and he would call out, "Oniggins, step forth!" Oniggins was the oldest and longest-serving of all messengers. He negotiated business transactions with every major neighboring kingdom. Regally, he stepped forward and said in his deep voice, "At your service, your majesty." The king said, "Oniggins, I want you to take this businessman to one of the conference rooms and draw up a trade treaty for gold from his master's kingdom. You know what we have to offer in return. I shall review it when you are finished." Oniggins bowed low and said, "Yes, your majesty," and regally led the businessman from the courtroom. Sometimes the task was dangerous. The king would call out, "Coggins, step forth." Coggins stepped out of the line of messengers and said, "At your service, your majesty." "Coggins, this knight wishes to attempt to slay the dragon at the cove of Alinar. I wish you to lead him there and assist in his fight." Sometimes I slip into accents when I read books, and it's going to happen interchangeably. I'm sorry, kids. Coggins had been trained to fight with two swords, as was the way of the land. His clipped, military-trained speech rang out, and he bowed his head and said, "Yes, your majesty," and gestured for the knight to follow as he strode from the courtroom. The king called out before Coggins, and the knight reached the door. "Coggins, take care of yourself." Coggins turned back, bowed low, and said, "Yes, your majesty," before leading the knight to the armory and stables in preparation for the journey. Smuggins listened every day to these tasks, eager to know what kind of thing the king would call upon him to do. He was certain the king would call on him any day, and he said so to all the other messengers each night when they gathered for dinner. In his head he practiced again and again, intoning the words, "At your service, your majesty," and "Yes, your majesty." The tasks the king assigned his messengers ranged from the great matters of the kingdom to the small matters of his court. Sometimes he called out, "Sasha, step forth." Sasha stepped from the line and curtsied before the dais, saying, "At your service, your majesty." The tones of her voice always sounded like the melody of a song. The grooms have told me that the feed for the horses is not the best quality available. Work with them and the household accountants to find something more suitable in the marketplace." "Yes, your majesty," Sasha sang, before she danced from the courtroom to the stable yard. Smuggins had been a messenger since he was a boy, but he was still quite young. The whole kingdom knew he had never been sent, and it was always a matter of gossip. Here's the kingdom I wanted to show. The illustrations are by Stephen Hesselman. When he overheard whispers about himself, he tried not to listen, knowing that the other messengers had so much more experience than he. But it was hard not to hear what people said. He must not look willing. Oh, he must not stand straight enough to please the king. Perhaps the king forgets about him. Well, the king knows what he's doing, so it must be something wrong with Smuggins. Smuggins tried to ignore the whispers. He knew the king knew each of his messengers by name. Niggins, Moggins, Coggins, Daggins, Sasha, Figgins, Smuggins, and Misha. Smuggins told himself that he was the youngest messenger, but one, and that was Misha, had only been brought on quite recently, so it was no wonder that neither of them had been called upon. He stood tall along the line of messengers along the outer edge of the king's courtroom. When the king needed him, he would be ready to step forward, saying, "At your service, your majesty!" and he would obey whatever command he was giving, saying, "Yes, your majesty," before walking from the courtroom, head held high. Oh, how he would burst with pride on that day! Until that day, when he could tell the king he was at his service, though he knew that it was his responsibility to look willing, to show the king he was ready. He kept his face up, hoping his expression seemed prepared. He made sure that he never behaved in any way that would damage the reputation of the king or of the messengers. He never spoke evil of the king. One day, the king called out, "Sasha, step forth!" and nothing happened. In the silence that followed, the king looked over toward the line of messengers. Seeing Sasha missing, he called, "Figgins, step forth!" Here are the illustrations of the messengers. Figgins broke from the line and bowed low before him, saying, "At your service, your majesty." Figgins' voice was high and reedy. Okay, let me redo that, okay?
"At your service, your majesty."
Figgins' voice was high and reedy. "Where is Sasha?" the king asked.
"She is ill, your majesty."
"Ill? Oh, dear. Thank you, Figgins." The king motioned him back.
"Yes, your majesty,"
Figgins answered as he stepped back into line. The king looked over the whole line of messengers, considering them for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Misha, step forth." Smuggins' eyes widened. "Misha? At your service, your majesty?" Misha stuttered a little as she answered. "Misha, take this tailor to the marketplace and show him the textile stall." "Yes, your majesty." And Misha led the tailor out of the courtroom, holding her tiny figure straight and tall as she walked. Smuggins was nearly reeling from the shock. Misha had been called Misha before Smuggins. But he had been waiting all these years. He had been ready for so long. Misha? Why? She hadn't even been a messenger for a whole year yet. Perhaps, Smuggins doubted for the very first time, perhaps he wasn't fit to be a messenger at all. And for just a moment, he bowed his head. It wasn't long before he raised it again, and looked ready once more. But the king's sharp eyes caught the movement, and he smiled wisely to himself. The next day all the messengers were lined up against the wall of the courtroom, eagerly awaiting their duties. The king called out, "Messengers, all of you, step forth." The messengers glanced at each other in bewilderment, and, stepping forward, answered in unison, "At your service, your majesty." The king stood from his throne and stepped down from the dais into the court. He came to stand before the line of messengers. "I have a question to pose for you, messengers. Who among you is the greatest? Who is the most honorable, the most useful, the best at his task? Who among you is the greatest? I want you to answer one by one. Feel free to say it as yourself, if you think you truly deserve the honor. I would like to hear what you have to say, for I wish to bestow a crown upon one of you." And he pulled a golden circuit from the folds of his robe. "Oniggins, step forth and answer," he called out. Oniggins stepped forth and opened his mouth. "Well, your majesty, as the oldest and longest serving of all your messengers, I believe it is my rightful place to be called the greatest and to receive the crown." And he stepped back. "Moggins, your answer." "Your majesty, if you remember, it was I who led your tradesmen to China and back, bringing with us the silk from which your robe is now fashioned. This act, I believe, qualifies me to receive the title greatest and the crown." "Daggins, step forth and answer," the king commanded. "Your majesty, it is I who accompanied you on the hunting trip in which you caught the white stag. I carried your bow and quiver. This act shows that I am the greatest and should receive the crown." "Coggins, your answer," the king called out. "Your majesty, I led the knight who killed the evil dragon at the cove of Alanaw. I risked my own life to go with him and save the kingdom from that horrible beast. This act most certainly qualifies me to be the greatest and to receive the crown." "Figgins, step forth and answer."
Your majesty, it is I who accompanied the royal prince on his long search for the legendary nightingale whose voice was more beautiful than the voices of the muses. I deserve the honor of being called the greatest and receiving the crown." "Sasha, your answer." "Your majesty knows you have never sent me on great daring missions as some of these others, but I have daily done my duties around the palace and in the surrounding countryside. It is my faithful service for which I should receive the title and the crown." "Smuggins, step forth and answer." There was a moment of silence. Smuggins knew he had nothing to say. He couldn't possibly compare his work to that of the other messengers. Even Misha had been sent on a task. Finally, though, he gathered his courage and stepped forward. Smuggins trembled as he spoke. "Your Majesty, I would find it very difficult to be in your position, and to choose between the great acts of the other messengers. They've all really done what they said. I don't know that I can say which one is the greatest of them, but it certainly is one of them." And he stepped back, shamed-faced, at not giving an eloquent answer like all the others. The king moved on. "Misha, your answer." If you please, sir, your majesty, sir," Misha began, "I don't want to belittle all the wonderful things the others have done for you, for they really are wonderful. But, sir, your majesty, sir, I think, well, sir, you see, Smuggins had been ready to serve you his whole life, and you've never called on him, but he's still been ready, and I think Smuggins is the greatest." Misha finished in a rush. The king smiled his wise smile once more and said, "That's what I think, too." Smuggins looked up in amazement. "Me?" As the king put the golden circlet on Smuggins' head, he said, "Sometimes, Smuggins, it is those who wait that have the hardest task." And that ends Chapter 1 of The King's Messenger. Tune in for more reading, and I hope you enjoyed this. Good night, we wish you well, and we are praying for you and thinking about you. If you liked this reading, please support its author, and go to the link that I will post up, and you can purchase the book. It's relatively cheap on either paperback like this or Kindle. She'd really appreciate it, and I would as well. Thank you for listening.